Well, thank you, Fred. Good afternoon, everyone. I wasn't here during the morning session, so I want to be very careful not to repeat what was being said. And the only way I can do that, since I know it was a very good and informative discussion, to be rather general and sweeping in my comments. And I'll talk very briefly, maybe, as you suggested, for up to 10 minutes, more general points. Then you also say that underlining theory of the Institute, which is so established and so respected in the city. And also to see so many people here at session dealing with Ukraine. I think that is a statement in its own right. And it's a significant statement because it indicates that in this city there's a great deal of genuine positive interest in Ukraine. And it reflects, obviously, Ukraine's own standing in the world. Just as a point of departure, let me make a very, very obvious observation. We're now in the 20th year of Ukrainian independence. That means that, in effect, a whole political generation has grown up in a country which is independent and which they feel is its own. And that, I think, is a new reality. And, of course, the longer it lasts, the more enduring it's going to be. During those 20 years, by and large, Ukraine's democratic record has been pretty good. Some shortcomings, we may talk about them, but by and large, pretty good. The country elected 4 presidents, every one of them in a free election. And to me, a free election is defined by the notion that one doesn't necessarily know in advance who's going to be the winner. Because we know of some other elections elsewhere where the winner is predictable, sometimes years ahead of the election. Rather unusual. That's a very good record. But I still think, however, in spite of the 20 years and the one generation and the democratic record, that there is still a touch of ambiguity or uncertainty about Ukraine and its future, its future status. Not a decisive ambiguity, certainly not a predetermined ambiguity, but a touch of ambiguity. Because a great deal still depends on 2 considerations. One is, how will Russia evolve, and what kind of policy will Russia pursue? And one can envisage different alternatives in Russia's near-term future, and different attitudes in that context towards Ukraine. And of course, a great deal depends also on how Ukraine conducts itself, both on the international scene and on the domestic scene. My sense is that on the international scene, there is cause for optimism, in spite of some rather pessimistic expectations regarding the consequences of Yanukovych's election. The record since his election has not been bad at all. He has been very pointed in his statements that Ukraine's unvarying priority is the European Union. Azarov has actually publicly even speculated about the year 2022 as the year of possible admission for Ukraine into the European Union. That may be a touch optimistic, but still, the very fact that this is up front, I think, indicates an attitude which on the whole is encouraging. What is somewhat less encouraging is the domestic political scene, and particularly in the area of democratic freedoms, constitutionality, legality, and so forth. One has a feeling that there is a risk of political repression. I think it would be highly premature to suggest that repression is the reality. But there are some events evolving, of which we all know, which could have cumulatively the effect of creating a politically repressive atmosphere. And that, of course, if it were coupled with a Russian policy, which would be more assertive, more focused on erasing what still many in the Russian elite cannot believe is an enduring reality, then the effects cumulatively could be more serious. Nonetheless, I think insofar as foreign policy is concerned, one has the sense that the Ukrainians have made it rather clear, in spite of some of the initial concessions they made to their big neighbor, that they are determined to preserve their statehood and that they see their future increasingly in the European context, and have been willing to continue with efforts to consolidate the openings to the West, to enlarge them, and to move them forward. And this is already generating some reactions, actually, in Russia, but in a way are a testimonial to that reality. Not only is the invariable priority of Ukraine movement to the east, to the European Union, but it is also a matter of actually pursuing activities which in some respects reflect that. I was just reading a few days ago an article in Kommersant, which some of you may have read, which deals with both the Russian reaction and the Ukrainian counter-reaction to Ukraine's decision to participate in the Sea Breeze 2011 exercise, which brings into the Black Sea for joint maneuvers with the Ukrainian Navy USS Monterey, which is a missile, I forget what it's a frigate or a cruiser, but anyway, it's a potent American weapon system. And this brought a reaction from the Russian Foreign Ministry to the following effect, quote, appearance of elements of the United States strategic infrastructure near the Russian border and reconnaissance in the Black Sea are threats to Russian security. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry then responded that it perceives no potential threats to any country in the region on account of this naval exercise. Moscow then responded by saying that, according to a Russian official who was interviewed by Kommersant, that when he, I'm quoting, when he was in the opposition to Viktor Yushchenko, Yanukovych did everything to thwart NATO exercises in Ukraine. Now that he is president, he authorizes them again and in the most provocative manner possible. That actually was a quote contributed by Konstantin Kusuchov, chairman of the Duma's Committee on International Affairs. Well, that actually was not the end of it. Kommersant then goes on to report that it has obtained a classified document that Yanukovych is actually boosting cooperation with NATO energetically and more so than Yushchenko. The document claims that in the framework of the NATO-Ukraine Commission in 2011, Ukraine is actually stepping up its cooperation with NATO to levels considerably higher than previously under Yushchenko. A Russian public official then said, the document we're talking about is a clear indication and proof that Ukraine is anything but independent in the formulation of its foreign policy. It does not mesh with its declared intention to remain out of military political blocs and to abandon the plans to integrate into NATO. I could go on, but this little flap, I think, is symptomatic of a reality which is much more complex than many of us feared, which is still uncertain in its final outcome. And much of that depends on the internal developments, both in Russia and in the Ukraine. But it is also my own view that as time passes, and in the next 5 or so years lead to further consolidation of Ukrainian statehood, a sea change will occur in the Russian psyche of the type that historically occurred only after a number of decades after the Bolshevik Revolution, but quite a few decades, until about 1950, 1960, regarding the Russian attitude towards Poland. Namely, that this is genuinely a separate country, genuinely a separate nation, with whom it is desirable to have good relations, and which nonetheless is not going to forsake its independence for the sake of unilaterally defined character of these good relations. And that brings me to my final comment, and I'll stop right there. It seems to me that if that condition prevails, something else very desirable is likely to take place. Namely, that in fact and paradoxically, the initial concentration on better relations with Russia, the avoidance of head-on conflicts with Russia, may have the paradoxical effect not only of consolidating Ukrainian independence, but of facilitating its more stable and more cooperative relationship with the West, in turn facilitating a similar movement by Russia. Because in fact, the Ukraine that is on good relations with Russia and moving forward towards the West is the Ukraine which is going to have a suction effect, together with the European Union, of Russia's own definition of its long-term future. So this is, in brief, how I sense the historical dynamics. And this is also one of the reasons why I attach my own personal sympathies to the side enormous importance to how Ukraine evolves. I used to say that if Ukraine is suborned by Russia, which I now think is less likely, Russia again becomes an empire. But now I think even further, that if Ukraine is not suborned, Russia is much more likely to become European.
Terrific lead-off comments. I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions on the NATO aspect, the Russia aspect. But before we open for that, let me pick up on a few of the comments you made at the opening of your remarks, which go more directly to the things we were talking about in the conference this morning. The potential conflict between Ukraine's foreign policy objectives and what's going on within the country. It was suggested during part of our discussion this morning that Ukraine may be headed toward, if it's not already at, a fundamental contradiction in policies. On the one hand, a commitment, as you said, to join Europe, whether as a full member or, well, as I say, whether to join Europe as a full member or in the intermediate stage, and maybe very short term, a comprehensive trade agreement of the type they're talking about now. But on the one hand, as you said, the commitment is to join Europe. On the other hand, it was argued by some folks this morning that what's going on within Ukraine, some of which you mentioned quickly, is headed in the other direction and is increasingly at odds with the values of Europe and indeed the West as a whole, and that those two seemingly different courses of European policy, Ukrainian policy, may add up to a fundamental contradiction that would wind up undercutting their basic foreign policy theme. What do you think about that? Do you think it's that severe yet, that it looks like a fundamental contradiction? And more broadly, you hinted at that already, but more broadly, what's your prediction? Will Ukraine evolve in the direction of the West, the values as well as the economic ties, or, as there are some disquieting signs, might it revert to a kind of post-Soviet kleptocracy, autocracy, etc., of the type that I think everybody here would be most unhappy to see?
I think that depends a great deal also on the reaction of the West, which means of the United States and of the European Union. I was struck that when Yanukovych went to visit the European Parliament, he was taken over the coals by quite a few of the European parliamentarians over this issue of domestic freedoms or potentially of repression trials. The Tymoshenko trial has become a kind of symbolic definition of the problem. But it certainly isn't limited just to her at this stage. We know that the former interior minister is being held in jail. We know, for example, that in Lviv, a museum dedicated to the repression in the Soviet era has been visited by the Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, and 16 employees of the museum were severely interrogated regarding their activities on the charge that they are divulging state secrets. So a museum dealing with Soviet repression of Ukrainian nationalism has its officials interrogated about their responsibility for divulging state secrets. That is kind of ominous. But the word ominous is the word that I use deliberately. It is ominous, but it is not generalized yet. It is not a pervasive phenomenon, but it is symptomatic of a threat. And this is why I did say initially that while on the one hand there is this positive thrust, which I think is sensible and on the whole balanced, and in keeping with the Ukrainian national interest in the realm of foreign policy, there is this other side, domestically, which if then is in some fashion accompanied by or reinforced by some developments in Russia in the foreseeable future, could make the next 5 years very sticky. And I don't think we're yet at a stage in which we can categorically assert that Ukrainian national statehood is a reality that is enduring and inevitable. It is strong. I think there's a whole new generation of Ukrainians who strongly believe in it. I think every passing year consolidates that. I think even within what was simplistically defined as the pro-Russian orientation in the elite, there is a mood, once that pro-Russian elite got into power, that this is ours, and we're not going to be letting someone else dictate it to us or share it with us. This is ours. A little bit, if I had to compare the mood, as I sense it from my knowledge of that part of the world, within this elite, I think it's a little bit like Gierek in Poland in the latter phases of the Soviet bloc. Gierek was, of course, subordinated in some sense to Moscow. But he certainly was not keen on becoming the 18th Republic. He certainly was quite clear in wanting to preserve the degree of independence he felt he was entitled to, and to enlarge it, and to consolidate it. And he was quite determined to make domestic decisions on his own, because that was the instinct, not only him, but of his elite. I think this sort of Yanukovych orientation is evolving in the same direction, and clumsiness by the Russians on this issue actually helps that transformation, but also vigilance on the part of the West. And I think the West has to be very clear in emphasizing the issue that you raised, that I very briefly also raised when I was in Kiev, namely that the domestic political scene defines Ukraine to us almost as much as Ukraine's external border. And the two are interrelated. And I think this point of view is very strong in Europe. I think it is also held very strongly by Ukraine's immediate neighbors to the east, who are the friendliest towards Ukraine, particularly the Poles, because they share the conviction that democracy within is the safest and most promising way of consolidating generally. So I think this is a view that we all share, and which is not an anti-Ukrainian view, which is not an anti-Russian view, because I do want to emphasize that much of what happens to Ukraine pertains to Russia, and that Ukraine can be in the forefront of the fundamental change in the East-West relationship.
Just to carry that to one more step, there were also a lot of comments this morning about the relatively passive stance that the U.S. has taken toward Ukraine in the recent past. If you were National Security Advisor now, as you were in the past, what would you be doing about it? What would be your suggested steps for U.S. policy changes now to try to promote the positive course that you're espousing and I think we would all like to see?
I think I'd rather not answer that question.
I've never known you to cop out.
I think there's a practical reason for the answer.
Okay. With that, I'll open the floor to questions and comments.